Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like
Hi, and welcome to Straight Talk About God video. I'm Jack. To Sabbath or not to Sabbath? That's not the question. This time we're going to talk about Hebrews 4. Hebrews 4. It could be one of the most controversial passages, first 11 verses in the Bible. Except that I can't remember any more than one preacher ever teaching on Hebrews 4. But it's an extremely important chapter to understand. It's all about rest. Rest. God's rest. But before we start, I'm just going to read it to you, okay? Read the whole thing. And now the context is Paul is just talking to the people saying the Israelites in the desert didn't trust God for going into the promised land. They certainly believed in God after 10 plagues in the Red Sea and the manna and all that stuff, but they didn't trust him enough to overcome their fear of the giants and the walled cities and he says, or the King James translated unbelief, okay? The last verse in chapter 3 is, so we see that they could not enter the promised land because of unbelief. Well, when you know that believe and faith in Greek comes from the exact same root, P-I-S-T, and it's a verb. It contains some type of action. Both those words come directly from a primary verb, pytho. So they didn't trust God. They didn't act on their belief. They didn't faith, with an E on the end of faith. Okay? Okay, chapter 4. Let us, therefore, not them, but let us, therefore, fear, lest a promise being left us of entering into his rest, God's rest, any of you should seem to come short of it. For unto us is given the gospel preached unto them as well, but the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith. Faithing, not being mixed with trusting action in them that heard it. For we which have believed do enter into rest. As he said, as I have sworn in my wrath, quoting, as sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. And what we're focusing on here is the word rest. Through all of these verses, rest. It occurs 9 times in 11 verses. Actually, 3 of those verses it doesn't appear in there, so out of 11, out of 8 verses, it appears 9 times. Verse 4, for he spake in a certain place of the 7th day on this wise, and God did rest the 7th day from all his works. God did rest. And, verse 5, and in a place again, if they shall enter into my rest. It's all talking about God's rest here, whatever that means. Verse 6 and 7 they don't include the word rest. Seeing therefore it remaineth that some must enter therein, and they to whom it was first preached entered not because of unbelief, again he limiteth a certain day, saying in David, today, after so long a time, as it is said, today, if you hear his voice, harden not your hearts. There's another day coming. Okay? There's another day coming. He said to David. Verse 8, for if Jesus, only it's really Joshua, okay, Joshua led them into the promised land, not Jesus. Right? For if Joshua had given them rest, if he had given them rest, then would he not have afterwards spoken of another day to David 400 years later? So then, he says in verse 9, there's still something going on here. There remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God. For he that is entered into his rest, he also has ceased from his own works, as God did from his. 11. Let us labor therefore to enter into that rest, the rest that still remains for the people of God. Not God's rest. See, there's two rests here, people and God. Lest any man after the same example of their unbelief fall. Okay? The word rest. Well, you know, you can't understand the Bible unless you pick it apart and get back to the original language and see what the writer wrote. Right? Many Christians adhere to the Old Testament as their guide to the New Testament. And if something says in the Old Testament, like God says, do this forever unto all generations, then whether it says yes or no in the New Testament doesn't make any difference. God said forever. Old Testament Christian. Well, if an Old Testament Christian believes in the New Testament at all, then he contradicts himself when he says that you've got to keep the Sabbath. God gave the Sabbath, the Ten Commandments and all that. I mean, it can't reconcile, okay? Paul, who wrote over half of the New Testament, tells us what the Old Testament really says. It really says. See? Do we throw Paul out of that? See? Because he says the stuff he says about the Old Testament practices, do we throw him out? Isn't Paul the direct apostle of Jesus Christ? Didn't Jesus Christ pick him personally? Didn't God pick Jesus personally? Well, why did God send Jesus? What was Jesus' mission? Well, we ought to be able to find out what Jesus' mission was by what he did and what he said. And what he did and what he said wasn't about salvation. It was about the kingdom. Everywhere you look in the New Testament, you find him preaching the kingdom. And when he told that was his gospel, that was his good news. That wasn't the good news about what he did. That was his good news to us and to his apostles and to Paul. The message of Paul is the exact same message, same gospel as Jesus. The kingdom of God is coming. And then he preached Jesus resurrected as the proof that kingdom word is true. Okay? So, mainly, the false argument that's used by some people call them legalists. Legalism. I call it egoism because legalism is based in ego. Ego is what drives legalism. You got to do this. You got to do that. I know. I said so. I know what's going on, and you know. That's what it is all about, ego. Okay? The false argument that they use is where Paul says he nailed the law to his cross. Paul didn't do away with the law. You can't do away with God's law. It says right here, forever, generation. Paul didn't say that he did away with the law. Huh? Well, what was his message then? His constant message was, you're saved by faith, not by works, not by the works of the law, because he first talked to the Jews and saying that the law, see, but he didn't do away with the law. He glorified the law. He venerated the law. He said the law was good. It served a definite purpose, and without the law, we'd be completely lost. Does that sound to you like he did away with the law? No, but he clarified the point that the law will not save you. He says, and James reiterates, you can't do 99.99% of the law and miss one little part, because if you miss one part of the law, you miss the whole thing. Paul clarifies what the job of the law was. The job of the law was to teach us that we were imperfect, that we couldn't even keep these 10 little commandments. He clarified that the law won't save you. And if you consider any part of the law, including keeping the Sabbath, as adding to your salvation, as contributing to your salvation, then you're wrong, because that isn't what the law was meant to do. Eh? You know, in places Paul talks about the mystery. Well, the mystery of salvation is, well, look this way. Was Abraham saved? Okay, yes, Abraham was saved. What does it say about Abraham? Abraham did this stuff and he was saved. He acted in faith, he trusted God with his life, and it was counted unto him as righteousness. God saw Abraham as righteous because of his faithing, his faith actions. Well, Abraham was almost 600 years before the law. The law didn't happen until 1453 or 54 or 52. And Abraham was alive in 1950. And yet he's called the father of faith. Faith and trusting God, acting in trust of something God has said in spite of negative circumstances. Leave your home and your family and go until I tell you to stop. Huh? What? Leave my whole... Okay, go. I'll do it. Obedience. Faithing. Well, that's the mystery, that we're saved by faithing. You know, God pulled a fast one on those Old Testament people. He gave them all of these Mosaic laws and stuff to help them act in faith. Not to save them, to act in faith. Leave your field fallow every 7th year. What? I can't plant any crops? What, a whole year? What will I eat? Don't worry about it. If you do that, I, God talking, I will supply you on the 6th year with 3 times as much. And when the 8th year comes and you start to plant again, you'll still have a year's worth of food left over. And don't you know, in one of the descriptions of why they were taken to Babylon, God said, you didn't keep the land for 490 years. You didn't keep the Sabbath for the land. So now we're going to keep the land for the Sabbath land for 70 years over in Babylon. That's one of the reasons that they went. They didn't follow God's law. He said, if you follow these laws, I'll bless you. If you don't, I'll punish you 7 times. Right? Now what I want to do is go through and see what this rest stuff is all about. Because that's where the crux lies. rest. Again, there are two different rests, God's rest and man's rest. Remember, a rest for the people of God? Okay. Verse 1, entering into his rest. That's God's rest, and it's number 2663 in Strong's. Okay, 2663. 2663, let me, 2663 is katapausis in Greek, katapausis. Well, 2663 comes from 2664, katapau. Katapau. Well, there's two words involved there, okay? Katapau means established, kata, established, pau, to stop. It's an established stopping, okay? Nothing left, ultimate stopping. Kata means down. Down. It's used in a whole bunch of different ways, but it means the end. Nothing left. Done. Period. Okay? Finished. Established. And pau is the word for rest. Rest. Repose. Okay? Well, katapausis is translated, is defined as reposing down. Reposing down. Okay? So, what does that say? It says God's rest is a place where he doesn't work. There's no works involved. He goes out on the back deck and watches the sunset. Okay? Okay? Verse 2 doesn't contain rest. Verse 3 contains rest. It says into my rest, into rest, and my rest. And they're both 2663. So it's the same rest. It's God's rest. It's God's place where he did no work. Okay? Verse 4, and God rested from works. That's not 2663, it's 2664. Which means it's right next to 2663, but maybe just the suffix is different. The katapausis and katapau. It's a different word at the end, but the roots are the same. In 2664, because of the change, the little change there, it means an instituting of the rest. God establishing his rest, his place of no work. Okay? 5, my rest, again, is 2663. The rest of God, God's rest. Verse 6 and 7 don't have that in there. Don't have the rest in there. But remember, he talked about David in 6 and 7, okay? And in 8 it says that for if Joshua had given them rest, the final rest, God's rest, 2663, then would they have not afterwards spoken of another day, like he said in verse 6 about verse 7 about David. David says there's another day. This isn't the final thing. There's another day. If Joshua had given them the final rest, then David wouldn't have said 400 years later, there's another day coming. Right? Verse 9, a rest for the people of God. That's not 2663 or 2664. It's not even close. It's 2,000 numbers away. It's 4520. Whole completely different word. And I'm going to just let that dangle for a few minutes, and we'll finish out this passage. Verse 10 outlines that there's no works left in the rest of God. Okay? For he that entereth into his rest, he also has ceased from all his own works, as God did from his. The rest of the people, if you enter into that rest, you're not working. The same way God didn't work in his rest. Okay? And then verse 11, it says, let us enter into that rest. that rest of no work, the way God did, so that we don't fall for disbelief like they did in the desert. Both of those rests, both of the rests, the rest of 9 and repeated in 10 and 11, are the people rest. Rest of the people. No works, like God did no works. And the first rest, katapausis, that's a place of no works. It says so right in verse 1, no works. No, not verse 1, verse, was it 3? 3, 4, rested from his works. Okay? The message of the word rest in the whole passage is, no matter which rest it is, no works. No works. Okay? You're done, you're finished. You can't work to gain this rest. Okay? Well, I want to take a look at the cross references for verse 9, because my margin lists 3 references for the rest in verse 9, and they're Isaiah 11:10, Ezekiel 34:14, and Zephaniah 3:17. Okay, and the context is the millennium. Armageddon has happened. Jesus is in Jerusalem. The world government is being set up, and we're going into the millennium, 1,000 years of peace and rest. Isaiah 11:10. Okay? And in that day, after Armageddon, Jesus setting up the government and all that, in that day there shall be a root of Jesse, that's Jesus, which shall stand for an ensign of the people, and to it shall the Gentiles seek, and his rest, Jesus' rest, shall be glorious. Oh, Jesus is going to give us some kind of rest. Keep that in mind. We're going to talk about Jesus' rest. Go to Ezekiel 34:14. 34:14. But it's the same situation, okay? Because at the end of the end times, after Armageddon, there's this huge gathering. This talked about in practically all of the prophets. A huge gathering of all the people to God, Jesus, Jerusalem, the Holy Land. Okay, and that's what 13 says. It says, and I will bring them out from the people, and gather them from the countries, and will bring them to their own land, and feed them upon the mountains of Israel, by the rivers, and all the inhabited places of the country. That's the gathering. Prophecy of the millennium. Now, 14. What happens after this gathering? You see, it doesn't use the word rest, but it tells what that rest involves. And it hinted at it in 13 already. I will, not they shall be okay there, I will feed them. Whoa. I will feed them in a good pasture, and upon high mountains of Israel shall their fold be. F-O-L-D, fold. And the Hebrew word there is is home. The word for home. And on the high mountains, their home will be there. Okay? It's not going to be they'll just pass through. They're going to live there, home there. There they shall be in a good fold, and in a fat pasture shall they feed upon the mountains of Israel. Pretty nice life. Jesus sets up a place of rest for them, doesn't he? Now go to Zephaniah, not Zechariah, but Zephaniah 3:17, okay? Again, it's the same situation, because in verse 10, from beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my supplicants, even the daughter of my dispersed, shall bring mine offering. And it goes on to say how they're going to show up to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem. And what does 17 say? 17 says, the Lord thy God in the midst of thee is mighty. They're gathered together and they're in the, okay. Oh, well, 16 locks it down to Jerusalem, okay? In that day, it shall be said to Jerusalem, fear not, okay? And then he will rejoice over thee, God, and he will rest in his love. He will joy over thee with singing. God, the Lord, thy God, will rest in his love. Well, let's define those words rest. In Isaiah, the word rest is number 4496 in Hebrew. And it's menukah, okay? But it comes from 4995, right next door. So it's just a little bit different at the end, okay? Same root, same idea. 4995 is the word rest. But menukah means repose and abode. Well, an abode, your house, your home, the fold, your home, okay? You get up in the morning, take your shower, go to work all day, 5 o'clock comes, you go home, and you rest at home from work, don't you? Easy, okay? Repose or an abode. The translated words, rest is almost last. Ease, quiet, still, rest, resting place. Right? Now Zephaniah has a different word for rest. Okay? Zephaniah's word for rest is charash. C-H-A-R-A-S-H. Charash. Rest. And it doesn't come from anything. It is the primary root word. Okay? Other words can come off of that, but that's the primary word. Number 2790 in Strong's. And it's defined as be silent, let alone. Oh. So in the Holy Land, God is going to rest while these people are being fed and all that. His rest. He'll sit back on the back deck and watch it all happen. Okay? That's his rest. Now we'll get back to 4520. 4520. This is wonderful stuff. Wonderful stuff. 4520, the word in Greek is sabbatismos. Does that sound familiar at all? Sabbatismos. S-A-B-B-A-T-I-S-M-O-S. That M-O-S is just the suffix, is all it is. It's not the root. The root of the word is sabbat, isn't it? Well, it comes from another word, 4521, right next door, okay? Sabbaton, S-A-B-B-A-T-O-N, Sabbaton, which is the Greek rendering of the Hebrew word 7676, Shabbat. It's the Sabbath. It's talking about the Sabbath there. So the word rest in verse 9 is the same as Sabbath, keeping of the Sabbath. It's defined as a Sabbatism, comma, repose of Christianity. What is the repose, the rest of Christianity? Rest, how do we get rest? Well, we get Jesus rest, don't we? Isaiah, the rest of the root of Jesse. What is Jesus rest? Huh? Wait a second. Other side of the paper here, right? Well, faithing, acting in trust of God's word, is the only way we enter into Jesus rest. What is Jesus rest? Huh? He's said to be the author and finisher of faith. He's not the author. That's a bad translation. He's the first goer. He's the one who openly taught us how to do this thing called faithing. And what is faithing? It's trusting God with your life on something that He has said in defiance of negative circumstances. People don't come back from the dead, especially if they've been legally dead for 72 hours. But God told Jesus, and He told us, that God said He's going to die and He'll raise Him up again after 3 days. God will put His Spirit into Jesus' body to the point where He'll raise up from the dead. Jesus didn't raise Himself, you know that, okay? That's our example. Trust God with your life against negative circumstances. Faithing. And that's Paul's constant message. You're saved by faith. You're saved by grace through faith. By faith are ye saved, over and over and over and over. How does that happen? Because Paul explains it. Again, God puts His Spirit in the body of the faither. When you act in faith, God promised to put a little bit of His Spirit in your body, called the earnest of the Spirit in another place when Paul says. You know, when you buy a house, they don't want to negotiate with you unless you're really, really earnest about buying the house. You really want to buy the house? Put down some earnest money. You want to buy this $1 million house? Put down $10,000 and we'll know you're serious. Well, He put down the earnest of His Spirit in our bodies that later will become our whole self, completely like Jesus, 100% God's Spirit. So, it also says Christ is formed in your heart by faith, by acting in trust of God's Word. So, what Paul says in verse 9 is that there remaineth therefore a keeping of the Sabbath to the people of God. In other words, when you act in faith, it's the same thing as keeping the Sabbath. Wow, well, what did Jesus say? Jesus confirmed that or not? Well, they were walking through the field of corn, and the Pharisees said, oh, your disciples, they're breaking the law. They didn't wash their hands. Ooh, he eats with sinners. That's against the law. Ooh, the Sabbath, you can't heal on the Sabbath. That's against the law. What did Jesus tell those Pharisees? He said, the Sabbath was not made for man. Well, the Sabbath was made for man. Man was not made for the Sabbath. Man was not created so he could keep the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made up to save man as a vehicle for him to act in faith of me. Leave that field fallow the seventh year. Don't go to work on the seventh day. Rest. Don't work. How will I can't make any money on that. How will I? Against negative circumstances. Okay? God gave us the Sabbath and all of the law as a vehicle to act in trust of Him. See? And those Old Testament people thought that keeping the law was what's saving them. It wasn't. It wasn't what saved Abraham. It wasn't what saved Jacob. Jacob didn't even know anything about any law. Huh? Man is not made for the Sabbath. Sabbath was made for man. So the question is, to Sabbath or not to Sabbath? No, that's not the question. The question is, to faith or not to faith? A wonderful little study. You keep the Sabbath every time you take communion. You keep the Sabbath every time you tithe. You claim a promise of healing, get up out of bed with the idea that God will heal you if you take some action, and he puts his Spirit in your body. And if it's right for you to be healed at that time, you get healed. Even if it's a miracle healing of cancer. Okay? Check all this out. Look up all these words. Thanks a lot for watching. God bless.